My name is Dr. Doreen Dodgen Magee. I'm a psychologist, I'm an author, I'm a neighbor, a mother, a friend, and I'm also a survivor of gun violence. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to speak to you all today because I believe that my story, which is not just a story, it is my experience, which is very real and which syncs with very profoundly reliable data that tells us that it is real for many people in our country, more than we want to admit, is so important for us if we have any chance of changing the trajectory regarding gun violence in our country. I believe with all of my being that I was put on this earth to love and celebrate everything that breathes and blinks. I grew up in a large family, and I had an extended family with almost 30 aunts and uncles. And they provided me all kinds of love and support and encouragement. And as I grew up, really one of the primary goals in my life was to become an auntie one day, because I knew that there was this important role in a child and in a grown person's life to have these people that were kind of one step away from their parents, but who were willing to invest in them and love them and empower them and teach them. And I wanted to be one of those people. Many years later, my tender, quiet, huge-hearted, sometimes timid, but always full of integrity, generous, and profoundly important sister-in-law came through for me. Her name was Laura, and she gave me my niece, my first niece, Sarah, who was born on Valentine's Day, which happens to be my favorite day of the year. It was really an exciting day. Over the course of the following 5 years, Laura honored me by adding Rachel and April to my quiver of nieces. I was so thrilled to finally arrive in this role. My sister-in-law's marriage wasn't a safe one for Laura or the girls, so they left their home in Washington State to move into my mother-in-law's home near us in Portland, Oregon. I loved being nearby and relished the mundane and milestone moments with them. It would be so fun to go there and just spontaneously use whatever we had to make a craft. The girls were very fond of painting rocks and painting my fingernails, and they would get the fingernail polish all over my skin when they would do mine. And to this day, whenever I paint my own nails, I leave some of it on my skin in honor of them. My last experience with them, it was the last celebration I would ever plan for them, and it was on the evening before Sarah's first day of kindergarten. On that evening, I hosted a backpack packing party for her, and we blessed her in preparation for this next day's big adventure. We wrote little love notes to stick in that backpack. She chose items that we had all bought and then would stuff in the backpack that would be her special school supplies. And we were all so excited for her to experience this monumental moment. The next morning, returning from my first few hours back at work after my own maternity leave, I put my 3-month-old daughter and 2-year-old son down for a nap. And in my silent kitchen, I pushed play on the answering machine and heard my aunt's voice shaking as she said that my brother-in-law had shown up at the house with a gun and that Laura and the girls were dead, and Margaret, my mother-in-law, was at the hospital. That's all I knew. I went into a panic. I knew that Dave did not like me, was not fond of me, because I had been a big part of helping Laura see the inequities and the abuse within their marriage. I was certain he was on his way to our house, and I hid in fear, calling my neighbors to say that if they saw a car pull up and a man of Dave's description jump out, to please call the police immediately. My husband was on his way from work, and this was the day before we had cell phones, so I couldn't communicate. I knew nothing. What I came to learn is that, desperately angry over missing his daughter's first day of kindergarten, my brother-in-law purchased a gun despite a restraining order, drove across state lines, and killed his family, his entire family, in front of my mother-in-law, who remained at the site with him for nearly 30 minutes until a neighbor restrained him. The police actually did eventually arrive, and Dave was taken to jail. We did not know. We were still living in fear. My mother-in-law, who was shot but survived, lived with the trauma of that day for the rest of her life. My strongest memory of that following year is not of the many grand juries or the press conferences, the meetings with district attorneys, the therapy appointments that I took my mother-in-law to, or even the evidence list peppered with my niece's and sister-in-law's body parts. It is instead that of cleaning my niece's blood out of my mother-in-law's hair and rebandaging the wounds from the shot she took while trying to protect her granddaughter. As her caregiver for the remainder of her life, I can tell you that witnessing the brutal murder of your family is torture, and the ripple effect for her, for the entire community who witnessed this murder that occurred on a front lawn, for the children who had shared a kindergarten classroom with Sarah, my niece, for my husband, who much of his entire family was taken that day, and for me, was massive. These ripple effects do not go away, and in fact, they embed trauma in the lives and bodies of survivors and witnesses that they then carry with them into a world where they are continually having that trauma piqued by the presence of firearms so easily accessed. After spending 22 years caring for my precious and beloved mother-in-law, who was living with the effects of unbelievable trauma, and raising my own children amidst the disruption both of the trauma and the ongoing trial against my brother-in-law, the ongoing experience of witnessing gun violence in other places in our country at such a massive amount, I arrived at a time where I can honor these lives with action. And I do that by doing things like this today, telling you of our experience. At the time of our family's deaths, which was 27 years ago, mass murders were not common news stories. They weren't. So stigma, isolation, and actually also fear of my imprisoned brother-in-law clung to me, and it kept me small. I thought our story was just that, our story, our experience. But now, I know differently. Our story is America's story. Our experience, it isn't just a little story. Our experience is America's experience. We know that 54% of mass murders are related to family violence. We know this because research tells us this. We also know that 70 women are shot to death by intimate partners every month. Every day, countless women like Laura take appropriate steps to protect their children, yet can't because of easy accessibility to firearms. In fact, when a firearm is present in a home or on the scene where a domestic dispute occurs, a woman is 5 times more likely to be killed by her intimate partner. This isn't just stuff we make up. This is research based on what is happening in our country. Loopholes in our laws and the lie that this is a political and partisan issue make it such that firearms are easy to procure. When you further that by the fact that lies about mental health and the gun lobby make you want to think that you're more likely to be or to use a gun nefariously if you have a diagnosis of mental health, That is a lie. The reality is that a person with a mental health diagnosis is much more likely to become either a survivor or victim of gun violence. I promise you that if 110 people every day were killed by any other force, which they are by guns in our country, or if any other force was the #1 cause of death for children in our country, we would be addressing it with the aggressiveness that we've never seen. And yet, there are only some of us doing that. There are only some of us speaking out and stepping forward and taking risks by talking about these statistics. The statistic that 110 people are killed every day and countless others wounded and or victims of the trauma that they have witnessed. Also, that firearms are now the leading cause of death in children in our country. But it's time for our legislators, our representatives, our elected officials to do the same, to stand up against the forces that empower the gun lobby and those that use firearms nefariously, those that use them to kill. I must honor, and I ask you to say their names with me right now: Laura, Sarah, Rachel, April, and Margaret, my mother-in-law. And the 110, other people killed every day in the United States. Take a moment to let that sink in. Take a moment to honor the 110 people killed every day by gun violence, and the many others touched by it in intimate, profound, and traumatic ways. And I must honor those lives by fighting against a system that privileges power and disregards the reality of gun violence as a preventable public health issue. I must stand up to a political system that allows the gun lobby to sell fears and lies. And I must do this so that no other auntie or uncle or neighbor or piano teacher or dance teacher or Sunday school teacher or grandparent or parent has to choose a coffin or coffins like we did in bulk for a 37-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 6-month-old baby. I must tell you my story because auntie love and every other kind of love must win and can only win by us working together to pass common sense gun laws and to enforce those that exist. The auntie in me sees the auntie and uncle and mother and neighbor and father and teacher and therapist and daughter and son and cousin and friend and human in you and begs you to join me in this work. As a survivor active in this movement, I also beg of you to listen to and take seriously and pass legislation based on the stories and experiences of our Black and brown neighbors, of our women and our children who are at the greatest risk of the impact of this violence. Use your passion for the people you love to fuel your work to end this public health crisis. I thank you so much for bearing witness to my story and to the stories over the past few days of the many survivors who I respect and care for with my whole entire being. And I ask you to become angry and passionate with us. And I ask your legislators, and I ask you to ask them to become angry and passionate with us, to end gun violence being a partisan issue and to pass legislation that will protect our lives. Thank you so much.